Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here as we are continuing our one-a-day march through the Old Testament, hanging out in the book of 2 Kings. Before we get into it today, let me open us up in prayers. Lord God, we thank you for this word that you have authored, inspired millennia ago, and have preserved for the benefit of those of us who are reading it today in this context. Your timeless word does speak truth, and we thank you for giving us the opportunity to avail ourselves of it, to hear from you, and to learn of ourselves. I pray that our week's readings have been fruitful, that this discussion would be guided by your Spirit and pleasing to you, that we might better adopt the applications that you would have in this word to live more like your Son, Jesus. In his name, I pray. Amen. Thank you. All right, you should have read chapters 11 through 15. That was the assignment this past week of 2 Kings. So coming up 16 through 20, we are now tipping into the halfway point of this book. As the name implies, we are still kind of marching through the succession of kings, both within now the divided nation of Israel and its sister nation Judah. You've probably seen, if you've been keeping track, and next week's lesson we're going to kind of go through it in detail, you've probably seen a consistent trend among the kings of Israel. 1 star, thumb down. They're bad guys. And the Judah tribe, every now and then you get a 3-star, a thumbs up, or a thumbs halfway. Every now and then, somebody kind of percolates that seems to be doing right in the Lord's sight, followed by, someone who's wicked evil. And I'm still kind of confounded as to the topsy-turvy. I mean, I get Israel because, you're succeeding a bad king, and that's kind of what you've seen, and that's who your dad is, and you kind of do that, or you've assassinated the person, whatever. But Judah to have, evil kings followed by righteous kings, and then that person's son is an evil king. I don't understand. There's probably a parenting lesson in there somewhere that I've not focused on, but I don't quite get how that's happening or why that's happening, but we've encountered things as such as we've been reading through these books. Anyhow, for whatever that's worth, and probably worth nothing. What do you guys have in terms of open mic? Any comments or questions from this week's readings? Rhonda.
So many of those chapters end with that. Isn't this written in the book of the annals? Where are those annals? I want to see them. I mean, have they ever found them, or any evidence of them, or?
Yeah.
I mean, they found the scrolls and all.
Uh-huh.
It just seems like there should be some, somewhere there's.
Yeah.
Because they mention it.
They do. The author does. And that kind of harkens the question that we had at Sharon's instigation last week. Talked about, they're still warring today, and we need to kind of remember that those comments were written by the person who put, feathered a scroll or whatever they were using at the time. And apparently, that comment suggests those records were certainly readily available at the time this book was written, and possibly even decently known to the original audience. But here we are millennia later. I don't know where those books are, if they still exist. But clearly by those repeated comments that there were some historian efforts back in the day to chronicle all the things these various kings did, good or bad. Probably, I'm guessing those unless they were, truly independent, they may have been commissioned by the king's family and probably, read more rosy-like than what we're getting in this. But I don't know the answer to your question, Ron. I don't know whether those records still exist, and if they are, what we'd see in them.
Like Chronicles, at least of Judah, or in Chronicles, like 2 Chronicles.
Right.
Picks up on, maybe because that's the lie or something.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you mentioned that. So let me pause there. As you guys, if you haven't taken a look at it recently, the reading schedule that we have, once we finish 2 Kings, we're not going into 1 Chronicles. We're going to jump and we're going to Ezra. And the reason why I did that kind of touches on what Patrick just mentioned. 1 and 2 Chronicles obviously are worthy books. They're canon. They're in Scripture, so I don't mean to discount the relevance. They go over a lot of the same material that primarily the Kings, I think a little bit of 2 Samuel is kind of touched on in there from a slightly different angle, kind of like the 4 Gospels are covering Jesus, but from, one's from this perspective, one's from this perspective. So there's a little bit of that going on, but honestly, for the sake of time, I wanted to be sure we kind of blaze some new territory before our time in the one-a-day ends. So to get back to your point, First and Second Chronicles does cover some of this stuff, and perhaps to Patrick's comment, maybe some of the annals were really within what we would know as First and Second Chronicles. I haven't looked it up. I don't know if those two are comparable or the same resource, but yeah, that's a viable option. But that's why we're not doing that, in case you wonder, why are we skipping ahead? That's why we're skipping ahead. That was a judgment call on my part. I hope you're okay with it. Any other questions or comments from this week's readings? Tessie.
Okay, something I don't know, on 2 Kings 13, 20 and 21.
All right, give us hang on. Don't launch the question. Let us get there first. 2 Kings 13, 20 and 21?
Yeah,
All right.
they were burying a man, somebody, and they put him in Elisha's tomb and he came alive. And that's all it says. It's like, okay, who was this and why?
I'm going to read that verse, or the two verses. Then Elisha died and was buried. Now marauding bands of Moabites used to come into the land in the spring of the year. Once, as the Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they, so I don't know if they is the Israelites or they is this marauding band, they saw a marauding band, so they threw the man into Elisha's tomb. When he touched Elisha's bones, the man revived and stood up. And then we move on to a second king, a different king. So just a little side story there. That's just as he was paying attention, I guess. And you were paying attention, so you scored. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. That's apparently, yeah. Elisha's, God dwells with him even, post-mortem, apparently. Yeah, that's not a very helpful answer to your question, Tessie, but there we go. I see it too, and I don't know what to make of it other than an intriguing, miraculous little episode just to keep the interest of the reader. Any other questions? Maybe one I could actually answer meaningfully. Yes,
I know we
Sharon.
don't know, but when in chapter 13, and I have verse 5 here, but it's evidently not verse 5 from what I'm reading, where he provided the deliverer. In my version, it said deliverer.
Yep, mine does as well.
He sought God's favor. God heard him, so saw the oppression and gave Israel a deliverer and an escape from the Arameans.
And yours says Arameans?
Wait a minute.
Because yours keeps saying Assyrians.
Yeah.
Because we've had that discussion. Mine says Arameans, and yours seemingly always says Assyrian when mine says Aramean.
When I read at home, I'm reading out of the NIV.
All right.
So this is the ESV.
Okay,
So,
there we go.
Yes, my NIV probably said that.
Uh-huh.
Don't ask me why I did it too. I have no idea. But anyway, but I don't even. Was it not verse 5? I don't even.
No, it is. It is.
Oh, he said, says a savior.
So the question is, who's the deliverer?
Yeah. The NIV says deliverer.
Yeah.
Here in ESV it says a savior.
Mine says deliverer.
Mine says a savior. Okay.
So the question, who is that, or just?
Yeah, I mean, could it have been a prophet? I mean, from somewhere. I mean, a commander of an army. I mean.
Yeah, so, I mean, that part would be wildly speculative, and I don't know that I want to venture there. But to back up just a little bit, because as I read through it, I kind of made a note of this. So chapter 13, my Bible, and I suspect yours as well, is subtitled Israel's King Jehoahaz. Jehoahaz. Yours probably says that, the bold font above. So this is, the latest Israel king. He did, guess, evil in the eyes of the Lord, as seemingly they all did. But in verse 4, so then he came under attack and oppression of the king of Aram, is what my translation, yours might say Assyria. But then verse 4, it says, Jehoahaz sought the Lord's favor, and the Lord heard him. For he saw the oppression the king of Aram inflicted on Israel, and then the verse that Sharon talks about with this deliverer. So I don't know who the deliverer is, if it's someone within the ranks, if it's a prophet, like a judge. This is the same kind of scenario that we saw when we read in the book of Judges, that God sent somebody to kind of right the ship once the Israelites realized, we've hit rock bottom and we've spurned the Lord, and let's go about face. I don't know who that is. I found interesting, though, the fact that this king that reigned for 17 years and did evil in the Lord's sight, he came to a point of humbling himself, apparently, to the Lord in a way that was genuine enough that the Lord saw that it was genuine, and he actually came to the guy's rescue. It wasn't just I'm grasping at straws and let me just see if I can find a way out. I'm going to pray to Yahweh. I'm going to pray to Baal. I'm going to pray to whomever, see which one answers. I think God's response in sending this deliverer or savior speaks to the heartfelt, repentant spirit that apparently Jehoahaz showed in that moment when God came to his rescue. But then, unfortunately, so the rescuer does come. They are released from the oppression of Aram. But then verse 6, but they didn't turn away from the sins that the house of Jeroboam had caused Israel to commit. Jehoahaz walked in them, and the Asherah pole also remained standing in Samaria. So this guy had a moment of tasting what it was like being in the Lord's will. The Lord showed up in a dramatic way, and then he just made his left turn again and went back to the ways of old. So doesn't hit exactly on your question, Sharon, but I did find that passage interesting, and that the Lord didn't forsake the people entirely. He didn't even forsake this evil king. Despite his showing up, the king didn't stay aligned with the Lord, sadly.
Are you going to talk about chapter 12?
Am I going to talk about chapter 12? A little bit.
Well, so in the part, like verse 4 through 8, give or take, where they're talking about repairing the temple.
I was not.
So the paraphrase, my paraphrase, Joash told the priest to take all the dedicated money, the census money, the vow money, the voluntary money given to the temple, and repair the temple. After 23 years, no repairs had been made. I mean, that's what it says.
Yep, it does say that.
It says, since you did do this, take no money from the assessors. Hand it over to repair the temple. They took no more money, and they made no repairs. That's exactly what verse 8 in mine says. So the priest agreed that they should take no more money from the people and that they should not repair the house.
Yeah.
So what's
the deal?
What was with that?
Yeah. So as I read that, yeah. So King Joash. In fact, let's table that. I want to get to King Joash. I'm going to remind me. I'm going to get to the beginning of the lesson, which was like a little quickie lesson. Then we're going to kind of plow over this, but I'm going to stop and hang out there and touch on that issue. Go back to chapter 11, the first chapter you should have read. So chapter 11 begins with, I'm going to pronounce her name, Athaliah. Hopefully that's decently close. That's kind of what it looks like phonetically. So she's the mom of Ahaziah, who was a king in Judah. Ahaziah was one of the commendable kings. He did right in the eyes of the Lord. He died, and so we read in chapter 11, verse 1, I'll just read it. When Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, saw that her son was dead, she proceeded to annihilate all the royal heirs. So she did that because she had a fancy to take that throne. She wanted to be the next in line. So first off, why would she have annihilated all the royal heirs? What would be the strategic reason for doing that? Just kind of be sure we understand the story. What's that? I heard a voice somewhere. Somebody.
If there's no one else to take it,
Yeah, you kind of eliminate anybody who might have a rightful claim to the throne. I mean, not that that's a lawful way to do it, but, if somebody, the next eldest son is alive, then, hey, I should be king, not you, Mom. If that guy's dead, then no one's raising their hand saying, hey, I should be king. So this was a fairly common tactic.
But it usually didn't pass to a woman if the woman
Yeah.
was the oldest.
Right. Kings were by definition male, still are, exactly. Yeah, there were queen mothers, as she kind of was, but not to the extent of being the sovereign of the nation. But we've seen this a little bit. We'll see this as we continue. This was a not uncommon tactic, and not just even in ancient biblical times. I mean, I suspect it's even alive and well, in some parts of our globe today. Somebody takes the throne, typically unlawfully, and to kind of solidify their place in that position, they'll slaughter any who might have a rightful claim, so that those folks can't scrounge up, supporters and kind of, rebel against this unlawful king or whatever. So she does this, but if she's the mother of Ahaziah and she's annihilating all the royal heirs, who are likely among the people that she has annihilated? Yeah, I mean, her kin. This isn't like somebody who came and overthrew the king and wants to annihilate his family. This is, Mom. This is Queen Mom. And so I think exactly right, Tiffany. You have to presume that. And we know that for sure because later on we find out that Joash was rescued. Joash was one of Ahaziah's sons, a little kid. And he was rescued because Athaliah was about, she and her people were wielding swords and just doing away with anybody who had anything to do with the royal line, primarily her kinfolk, which is just astounding.
But yeah, didn't he have a different mom?
I think he did, yeah. Well, again, Athaliah was his grandma.
Okay.
So Athaliah was not, she was related to him through her son, Ahaziah. But yeah, this is grandma that, wants to kill me and all my siblings. So anyhow, Joash gets rescued. This is the same Joash that we're going to revisit in chapter 12. Let me read verses 2 and 3 of that where I left off. So we're back in chapter 11. Jehosheba, who was King Jehoram's daughter and Ahaziah's sister, secretly rescued Joash, son of Ahaziah, from the king's sons who were being killed, and put him and his nurse in a bedroom. So he was hidden from Athaliah and was not killed. Guess where he was hidden? The safe place for him to be hidden. The temple. I think it's kind of strange. That would suggest that under her reign, people didn't go to the temple too much. They didn't do things. Where would she not find him? Let's go. The place where the Lord dwells, because she's not going to be there. She's not going to send anybody. Verse 3. Joash was in hiding with Jehosheba in the Lord's temple 6 years while Athaliah ruled over the land. So Queen Mom, does what she does, thinks she's eliminated anybody with a rightful claim to the throne, rules with apparent disregard to the Lord or his temple, because the lone survivor's hiding out in a temple for 6 years, not to be discovered. Now let's jump to chapter 12. Not yet to where Sharon wants us to look at, but the first 2 verses. Can I get somebody else to read the first 2 verses of chapter 12? Show me by hand so Mark can get up to you with the microphone. All right, you don't have to get up there, Mark. Right. Gary, thank you. Chapter 12, 1 through 2.
In the 7th year of Jehu, Joash became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem for 40 years. His mother's name was Zibiah. She was born of Beersheba. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoah, the priest instructed him.
Perfect. All right, actually, read verse. No, you don't. Stop right there. I want you to stop there. All right. So we do see this Joash does become king. And the part that I wanted to spend just a few moments talking about was verse 2, where he did right in the eyes of the Lord. My translation says, throughout the time Jehoiada the priest instructed him. Yours should have something similar. Gary's read something similar. So it seems like this young fella, he was 7 years old when he became king, so obviously you're typically not fit to rule a nation at age 7. So he has some advisors helping him, and surely somebody's, doing it on his behalf, to some extent before he becomes an adult. But he has Jehoiada the priest who is instructing him. And during the time of Jehoiada's involvement in his life, Joash is doing right in the eyes of the Lord. That verse seems to directly connect and correlate the two. Joash's ability and willingness, desire, and effectiveness in being right in the eyes of the Lord seems to be directly related to Jehoiada's influence on his life. And I don't know that I necessarily have any questions about that, but I just felt like that was worthy of kind of contemplating for a moment and reflecting not just on Jehoiada as it relates to Joash, but X as it relates to us, or maybe us as it relates to somebody else. To whom have we been like, who have been our Jehoiadas is maybe my question. Or to whom are we a Jehoiada, are we? Are we people that are exerting this level of godly influence in the lives of others that are helping their storyline to be right in the eyes of the Lord because we're kind of acting like Jehoiada did to Joash? Or that might be harder to answer, but looking back on your life, was there a Jehoiada in your life? Somebody who gave you some godly counsel, maybe in your formative years as you were trying to figure out how do I live and what worldview should I adopt or whatever else. Was somebody who kind of came along. It could be mama, could be dad, could be somebody disconnected from your family. Can I hear 1 or 2 of you maybe comment on that if you have anybody you can think of along those lines?
My grandma.
Your grandma. Tell us about grandma. Or what did you call her? What did you call her? Come on, grandma. Grandma, okay, all right.
I did just call her Grandma.
All right. Well, I mean, sometimes it's, Mimi or whatever. So grandma, all right.
Since we were military, I didn't actually get to see her very often. Several years would go by when I didn't get to see her, but she always got up before the sun came up, made herself coffee, and then sat down with her Bible. Never failed. And just, I know that her prayers were always forming like our family and stuff, and she was just so faithful. And they always said the pew, she was a back row Baptist to the ninth.
Okay.
Her pew, they were like that in Ruth's pew.
Ruth.
Always here, and this is her spot. So I just like her.
Excellent. All right, so Grandma was Tiffany's Jehoiada. Anybody else have a Jehoiada person you would like to give a little shout out to?
How about
Go ahead.
if I offer a contrast though?
Sure.
Not necessarily a contrast like bad way, but everything that we see as an example here in Kings and Chronicles is priests or prophets speaking to kings. And we're kind of trying to do a comparison as to who's the Jehoiada in our life, but we're not kings.
True.
You know?
Yep.
And so I think we probably all have them.
I would hope so.
I think we do.
Yeah.
But I don't think that we give them the proper kind of a, I don't know, what do you want to say, equivalence, because we don't see them as that their instruction would be similar to this, because we're not in the view of a king.
Well, and that's part of why I pause here, because I do think we probably, and I wasn't equating Jehoiada to a priest and us as king, so yeah, it's I'm taking this context and trying to, apply it to us as regular folk who have regular folk. And our Jehoiadas may be our pastor, it may be our grandma, it may be our neighbor, it may be our kid. I mean, it could be whomever. But I think the point you made within that is, sometimes we don't kind of think about them as having served that role in our life. And which is why I felt like I want to just pause for a second. And even if we're not hearing about 7 different people, it's worthy to contemplate for a moment, and maybe as we leave this room, contemplate more. Who were those people in our lives who had that kind of an impact? The effect of Jehoiada on Joash was tremendous. That verse, I'll get to in a second, Trey. That verse suggests that when Jehoiada died, Joash went off the rails. The rest of the passage doesn't say as much. It's as though Jehoiada lived the entirety of Joash's reign. I don't know that to be the case, but Joash's reign, its entirety was right in the eyes of the Lord, and that verse really directly links that effect to the cause being Jehoiada's influence on Joash. And so I just, like I said, wanted to see if we couldn't pause and contemplate folks who had similar roles in our lives and challenge ourselves to play similar roles in the lives of others. Sharon, you had your hand up.
And sometimes let's just say if you were that person, you were the grandma.
Okay.
You don't realize what you're doing or you do. She knows that she's praying for her family and, God's going to guide and protect and, all that. But sometimes they don't realize what kind of a reach they have.
Right.
Yeah, she prayed for them and God led them. But now here's Tiffany. What's Tiffany doing out in the world? Who is Tiffany guiding? Who Tiffany may not even be realizing what she's doing just from the example that she saw of Grandma. Or, we don't realize how far her grandma's reach goes.
Yeah.
And it can go for generations.
Amen.
Yeah.
Agree. Barbara.
Well, I think God puts somebody in your life at different times when you need that person.
Agree.
I mean, I can think of 4 or 5 people that were in my life when I really needed them because something was going on, and God used them to, sometimes it was a pastor, sometimes it was a close friend.
Great point. Great point. And so let's touch on that. So this narrative, suggests that there's kind of a lifelong presence. And I could be reading into it, but to Barbara's point, that influence may have been more of a season in one's life, as it was in Barbara's idea, Still had a tremendous impact on the rightness of your life in the eyes of the Lord. Good point, Sharon. So let's think of that. I do need to move on, but I want us to think about, that level of influence that was given to us, and I want to think about the opportunity we have to give that level of influence to others. made a big difference in the life of Joash, which made a big difference in the life of the people of Judah during Joash's reign. Okay, so now we're at chapter 12, and Sharon had an earlier question pertaining to the repairing of the temple. As I read that narrative, I read it similarly to you, Sharon, that Joash, at some later time, we're not told exactly how old Joash was. We're told there was a span of 23 years of inactivity. We know that he reigned for 40 years. Where did I find that somewhere?
Right.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, and things got done during his life. So if you kind of do the math on that, he was still, I think, on the front third probably of his reign when he says, okay, we got to rebuild the temple. Now here's what I want y'all to do. I don't know why it takes 23 years to figure out nothing's been done. I mean, that's a little bit of administrative lack. I'm not going to blame Joash, maybe the people who were in charge of that. I don't know. But 23 years later, basically nothing's been done. I read it to say they already collected the money. Right. They just didn't spend it and do anything with it. Right. And so Joash comes in and says, hey guys, what gifts? Remember 23 years ago I said y'all need to be putting hammer and chisel to stone and not just sitting on your rear ends having collected a bunch of money. Why haven't you done this? And they didn't have a good answer, and so I think he just kind of shut them down and went to Plan B, and Plan B was kind of the next passage. And I didn't identify exactly what it was, but my little written notes to this were he came up with a different, what did I write here? After many years of inaction by the priest, Joash scolded them and implemented a different process, resulting in the appropriate funding of appropriate repairs. That's what I had for verses 6 through 12. That's kind of how I read what happened. Is he just sort of said, you guys blew it. I'm going to turn to somebody else. We're going to use the money you got, but you're not going to do the repairs because you've kind of proven yourself not trustworthy. So I'm going to take the money, give it to these other folks, and they're going to do it. And they did it. And there was, I thought, an interesting comment that there was no accounting needed because these people, verse 15, no accounting was required from the men who received the money to pay those doing the work since they worked with integrity. Oh, that was pretty interesting. I made a little note of that as well. Tony.
Well, I want to go back to verse 3 for a second.
Please don't. That's the bulk of my lesson. That's the bulk of my lesson. I'm going to have you read it in a second. But that's the bulk of my lesson, Tony. Before we go back to verse 3,
Move it along.
Before we go to verse 3, that's kind of how I read that issue, Sharon. I'm not sure if that addressed kind of the questions you had on that or not, but
in 9, just right after that in 9, he says, he took a chest and bored a hole in it and put it in the temple. This is not the chest of Joash. This is the chest of Jehoiada, right?
This is the chest of Joash.
This is the chest of
Yes.
Okay, okay.
And Sharon's asking that question. A good number of folks in this room will know what we're talking about, and many won't. Our church had, as part of its annual, really kind of tithe celebration, we had a thing where at the end of a service, all of us would come down and we would put money in what was called the chest of Joash. That was during Dr. Ed Kirkland's time, and so that's a reference to this.
IMB.
What's that?
For the IMB.
Was that for IMB?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Anyhow, so yeah, this is
In December.
this is that chest. Yeah, that's where that whole chest of Joash from our church heritage came from. It's this episode right here. All right, Tony, you wanted to get us back to chapter 12, verse 3.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Would you read it out loud first?
Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people continued to sacrifice and make offerings on the high places.
Perfect. Okay, so we do see that. That is a bit of a head scratcher because we're told that Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord's sight. Was there a question? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Well, I think the priest taught the king, and the king saw that things weren't being done at the temple that were supposed to be done. They were being done in high places. So they had them fix the temple so that they could get away from doing sacrifices at the high places.
Makes sense. Yeah, if we have no temple and the people are using these other, let's pause. I'm going to get into that. That's perfect. We touched on this a little while, like many classes ago. I'm honestly forgetting how many. But let's just recap what our understanding is. What were the high places? Do we recall?
There were locations of worship centers to deities that were foreign to the Israelite religion, but yet had also occupied the land before the Israelites occupied the land. And they were worship of deities from both surrounding nations that everybody opposed Yahweh. Every one of these deities
Perfect.
or religious systems opposed Yahweh and tried to solidify themselves as if they were some form of creator or establisher or provider or sustainer. And they went by different names.
Just stop right there. Perfect. That was great. So the high places are exactly what Chris said. These were places of worship for people, original occupants of the land. Recall this, I mean, Judah, what we would know as the Promised Land, it wasn't just vacant. I mean, there were people there when the nation of Israel was brought to them, and then they were sent wandering for 40 years, and they got back, 40 years later. This place was occupied. It was occupied with Jebusites and Canaanites and Hittites and Hivites. All the ites were there, and those nations didn't worship Yahweh God. They worshipped a variety of other false gods, deities, to use Chris's word, good word. And so the high places, typically they were, in fact, topographically high, in that they were in an elevated spot within or near a town. I mean, they were literally high, like you could see up and see where these places were. But they were essentially places of worship to pagan deities. And they were erected and created by these former occupants of the land. That was where they would go and do their deal to their God, whomever that was. The nation of Israel comes in, is supposed to displace all these people. They do about 80%, well with that. They don't completely. High places still remain. And unfortunately, in part because they remain, perhaps in part because the temple's in a state of disrepair, these high places become worship centers even for the Jews. We first touched on this, and we discussed this back in 1 Kings 3 when Solomon took over after David's reign. And verse 3 talked about how he loved in 1 Kings 3:3, how Solomon loved the Lord, but he also sacrificed on the high places. So that's the first connection that I saw to an official national connection of sorts between the nation, at that time the nation of Israel, one unified kingdom, and these high places. And we've seen throughout references like the one that Tony wanted us to circle back to, and we were going to anyway, and we did in fact, yet in my translation, the high places were not taken away, that people continued sacrificing and burning incense in the high places. We see that as you read more this past week, if you did, in chapter 14, we see the same verbiage again. We see King Amaziah. Can somebody read the first 4 verses of chapter 14? Show me by hand who you are. Chris, thank you.
So 14, 1 through 4?
Please.
In the second year of Joash, the son of Jehoash, king of Israel, Amaziah, the son of Joash, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoaddan of Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, yet not like David his father. He did in all things as Joash his father had done. But the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places.
All right, perfect. So we have another king in Judah, Amaziah, who did right in the eyes of the Lord, yet the high places were not removed. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 4. Can somebody take over and read that passage? Show us by hand who you are, so Mark can come to you with microphone. Thank you, Coach Hudson.
In the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, Azariah, the son of Amaziah, king of Judah, began to reign. He was 16 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jecoliah of Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all his father Amaziah had done. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. The people still sacrificed and made offerings on the high places.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Coach. Last reader, can I get somebody to read same chapter 15, verses 32 through 35? One last reader, then I'll kind of take over the reading tasks. Somebody stick your hand high in the air so Mark can come to you with the microphone. Patrick, thank you, sir. So chapter 15, 32 through 35. Go ahead.
Forgive the pronouncements.
It's all right. Yeah, I know y'all have hard names to be
32
wrestling with.
35. In the second year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, began Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah, to reign. 25 years old he was when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord. He did according to all his father Uzziah had done. Howbeit, the high places were not removed. The people sacrificed and burned incense still in the high places.
All right, you can pause right there. You can pause right there. Yeah, pause right. All right, thank you. All right, so we have four successive kings in Judah. We have Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, and in Patrick's translation and in mine, the name Azariah and Uzziah are interchanged. So you might have Uzziah, you might have Azariah, you might have both. They're one and the same. This is the same Uzziah that Isaiah talks about in the so-and-so year of Uzziah that I saw this vision. So that's the same guy. And then we have Jotham, who Patrick read about, who took over from Azariah/Uzziah. All of those, from Joash, Amaziah, Azariah, Jotham, all of those are identified as having done right in the eyes of the Lord. One translation says yet, one translation says but, Chris's translation said nevertheless, and yours was interesting. Yours said the high places weren't destroyed. What was the words yours used? Say it again?
Howbeit.
Howbeit. Yeah, I was like, oh, that was interesting. All right, so in each of those, there's like this transition. Did I, great in the eyes of the Lord, yet, or but, or nevertheless, or howbeit, the high places weren't removed. So I want to talk on that for a second. I want to talk about the persistence of these high places and who's to blame. I think the author is telling us this because it's clearly significant. The fact that the high places are still there is significant. One can read, I was one, who read those passages and felt like the author was indicting this king who had done right in the eyes of the Lord, and yet, nevertheless, howbeit, these high places are still there. But if we read those verses, so I put on my lawyer hat and try to kind of read precisely with the wording. I'm going to use my translation, which says the word yet. So let's the one that we're at last, which was chapter 15, verse 35. Yet the high places were not taken away. The people continued sacrificing and burning incense on the high places. The other verses read essentially the same in my translation. So that phrasing is kind of mirrored and replicated throughout. Suggesting we have one author who's kind of writing this, looking back into history. He's not living it contemporaneously, or he'd be long dead, at this point. So somebody's writing this, looking back and reflecting, maybe even having access to the annals of the kings, or whichever one of you asked that question, Ron, it was you. So the author's introducing this, but I, as the lawyer, look at this and say, okay, the author is not saying, yet he did not remove the high places. There is not any verbiage in here that says, the king is to blame for this. So my initial gut is that he's kind of dampening the king's reign by saying, but the king failed in this regard. It actually doesn't say that. The two kind of buttress each other to where we think it's kind of the same thought, but I'm thinking, again, as a lawyer looking at this, maybe microscopically, that there could have been a way to phrase this very plainly that would have linked this failure to the king, and it's not worded that way.
Weren't they living, coexisting with these people? The Israelites were with these other people. And so were they doing what their sacrifices and their customs, but still allowing the others to do what they did every day?
A good question. So and that kind of segues into the next kind of looking at this verse. So if I can just table that for just one second. The verse clearly has concern about the ongoing presence and use of these high places. Again, I thought that it was maybe blaming the king for them, and yet really the only people that I think are being criticized in these verses are, quote, the people. The places are still there. They weren't removed. Again, it's a passive. They were not taken down. Not the king didn't take them down. The king defied the Lord and didn't take them down. It was just they were not taken down. And, quote, the people continue to sacrifice and burn incense on these high places. If your question, Rhonda, is who were the people? Are the people the Jews only? Are the people the Jews and the fellow inhabitants of the land who may not be Jewish? I don't know the answer to that question. I think that people clearly include the Jews. Or the Judaic, I mean, at this point, it's divided nation. They include the Lord's people, maybe not exclusively, but the Lord's people, I think, are being called out for this behavior, in part because these places were still there and kind of available for the people to use. And Tony's thought maybe it's because there's not a temple, and so they're kind of using this as like the next best place.
They're easy to get into.
They're easier, yeah. The high places are everywhere. There wasn't a temple in every town. I mean, there was one temple. It was a grand thing, and it was in Jerusalem. And never, I mean, you could worship where you were, but the temple was like the central place, and it was kind of by design the central place. Whereas these high places are scattered throughout. You probably had, 1,000 high places as opposed to one temple. So, is there some proximity bias? I got a high place right here. I got the temple that's 300 miles away and a week's journey on a camel. I'm going to go to the high place, because I don't want to deal with that or whatever.
Like turning on your TV.
They were supposed to be destroyed, yes? By commandment, I can't remember if anybody remembers, is that?
Yeah, and I would love to say that I remember clearly too.
I shouldn't have said it, but anyway.
No, it's a good question. So so we have an issue. I'll get these hands. So we have an issue with the places being here. We have an issue with the people using them. I do not see in clear wording an issue that the king was himself to blame for this, but the places persisted. The places were used by the people, and that's clearly a bad thing because the author's telling us this repeatedly. Despite the fact that we have kings that are did right in the eyes of the Lord, the people are still going to these high places. Two hands, I think it was Lee and Sharon. Sharon, you go first.
Back where you read earlier the one verse in 1 Kings,
Yeah.
when we first started talking about the high
Yes.
places, there was no temple at that point.
Right, because Solomon had yet to build it.
So there was no centralized place.
There was a tabernacle. I mean, there was a temple that was cloth versus.
And they built the temple, and so was it not my understanding that the high places, like Tony said, were built because they might have been closer to this, that? And just because I'm going there to worship at the high places doesn't necessarily mean I'm worshiping a deity. I mean, I could be doing all I'm supposed to do in a Jewish sacrifice. I mean, could they not? I mean.
Yeah, they could.
I mean, I could, just because it's closer, I'm going there to do it rather than going to the altar at the temple.
I don't disagree, and I think one could indeed genuinely worship the Lord in a high place.
Right.
But I think the danger and why we're seeing this repeatedly is there's peril in that.
Right.
You could be genuine, and maybe you're so fortified in your faith that you're fine, and you can do that the rest of your life, no issues. But, what about your kid who sees that and is equating the high place to God, and maybe this statue that, I don't know what this is, but maybe this is a representation of God, and now he's bowing down to an Asherah pole thinking I'm worshiping the Lord Jehovah, and we have problems that when you try to intermingle. So I think, yes, to answer your question, yes, but. And the but is, this is concerning enough that we're now hearing this repeatedly from the author, that there's something we need to be doing differently. Lee, you had your hand up.
She covered part of it.
Okay.
The author of 2 Kings, 1 Kings, I believe is Jewish.
I do too.
So he is looking at it from a pure Jewish standpoint. So anything, as in this case the high places, is evil in the face of the Lord, in the eyes of the Lord, and also in the face of the writer. So that's part of why he emphasizes that.
I agree.
And I certainly would agree with you that, and I've seen it actually in Israel, some of the high places. They're still there. The Asherah poles are gone, but the carvings and the niches are still there, cut into the rock. But I also agree that because there was no temple, and the temple after it was built is in one place, and believe me, if you had to walk, and I've seen it, driving, if you had to walk to the temple, you aren't going to get there maybe once or twice a year, because it is a big effort. Even though it's a small country, it's a huge effort on foot or on a,
Sure.
you know. So the convenience makes a big point.
Agree.
And if you are devout, either way, either to the gods or to Jehovah, you could use that place as a common place to worship if you are devout. If you are wishy-washy, then the other gods may have an influence on you, and then we have this problem which we have today,
Agree. Yeah.
4,000 lives later.
Well said. Agree. Barbara.
In Numbers 33:52, God told Moses,
Does this answer Patrick's question?
in the land of Canaan, that then you shall drive out all the inhabitants
Right.
from the land before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places.
Okay, thank you. So we do have an answer question. So this is
34, 12, and 13 is very similar.
similar. Okay.
Making covenants with the inhabitants.
So the Exodus was when they got there, the doorstep the first time before they got circled back, and the Numbers is what you read. So that's now with Joshua. I mean, Moses is still alive, but that's Joshua's about to take them in. And hey, remember I told you 40 years ago? This. All right, so good. So the high places should be gone. They're not. People are using them. Now, I'm going to kind of cut right to it because I have a couple minutes. It appears that God did not direct these kings to remove these high places. I reached that conclusion because each of these kings is commended for doing right in the Lord's sight. Yet, nevertheless, but howbeit, the high places are there. I don't think the author would commend these kings for doing right in the Lord's sight, and yet these kings defied the Lord and allowed these high places to remain. I think the conclusion one has to reach logically is that God didn't direct these kings to remove the high places, which begs the question, why didn't he? Which is another way of asking, why were these high places allowed to remain? God could have wiped them out. God didn't need the Israelites to come in, telling them in Exodus or in Numbers, you guys do this. God could have just zapped, eliminate. High places are gone at the spoken word, like man was created by the spoken word. Man was formed. Yeah. Like creation happened by the spoken word. God could have done it just like that. He tasked man to do that. Man didn't do that. But he could still have said, I've had enough of these high places, they're gone, and now there's no temptation. God allowed the high places to be there. It appears by my reading, God did not direct the kings to remove them, or they would not have been seen as doing right in the Lord's eyes, and yet clearly defy the Lord and allowing these high places to remain, which to me sets up what I'm going to phrase in modern verbiage, a freedom of religion scenario like we have in our current society. God allowed the high places to be there, despite his ability to eliminate them or direct a king to, or force a king to do it if the king wasn't so inclined. He allowed them to be there. He allowed these people to continue sacrificing and burning incense on the king. It's not much different than the freedom of religion that we have here, where we could drive our car, we're not having to use camels and pack mules, we could drive our car 5 minutes and pass all manner of churches. Most of them have Christian labeling, some of them don't. We can go, drive a little further and find a place that's as hedonistic as possible. We have the ability and the access in our country, similarly to what these people had, to worship or not as they choose. Why would God allow that situation then? Why would he allow that situation now? Quick thought on that before we wrap up in our prayer. You had
Because we're sinners and he wants us to make a choice.
Okay. He told them numerous times, and I think we'll see it further ahead before we end this chapter, or this book, to destroy them. So he's not, the command was given, but we're still disobedient.
Yeah.
Like Tony said. And, he didn't, I think that's why he didn't just wipe them out himself, because he gave them the instructions to do it.
Agree.
No one's still doing it.
Agree. Yes, thank you. Brenda.
From the very beginning, he wanted them set apart. And it totally set them apart at the highest level, which was worship. They were set apart from the others.
Agree. Any other thoughts or comments on that?
If you wiped out all the other choices, there'd only be one choice. And so you wouldn't have a choice.
Agree. I love how you put that. Yeah. To me, free will means we have the ability to choose and we have choices available. And I have the ability to choose and my choice is one, then I'm really not exercising my ability to choose because I can only do the one thing. Or there's 7 different things, but I don't have the ability to choose. I have to do one even though I've got 2, 3, 4, and 5 available. That's not free will either. Free will is I can choose by my capacity, and I have things that I can choose between. Yahweh God, worship in the temple, offer incense at the high places. It's the same God. He wants us to choose him, but he doesn't force us to choose him. He doesn't pre-program us to choose him and only him. He gives us the opportunity and the choice options, him or not, be faithful or not, be obedient or not, love him or love others, worship him, worship self, whatever the things may be. I think that's kind of the essence of how God designed this human race, is he wants us to choose to worship him, and it's seen here. So I found this interesting because, again, maybe it's too much of the lawyer mind, but I'm seeing freedom of religion kind of screaming as I read this thing, and yet the high places were there, and people were choosing to use the high places. Maybe for logical reasons, it's convenient, and I got one in my own hometown versus going down to Jerusalem. Maybe I can be pious and faithful to the Lord, even despite the fact that I'm worshiping in a pagan setting. Maybe I can't. Those are, I think, part of how God designed our experience and our interactions with him, to give us the ability and the opportunity to choose him if we so decide. That's what pleases him. Without faith, it's impossible to please the Lord, and faith is a function of choice. Let me close this in prayer. Lord, we sometimes are confounded by the choices that are in front of us, and I can speak personally. I wish sometimes you'd eliminate some choices that I find tempting and wrong, or that our society is running down and away from you, Lord. But in your master plan, you have designed humanity to have free will and to have the ability and opportunity to choose you or not, as we see in these passages and as we see in our current context. I pray that as we read these passages and we read your word, that we are more inclined to choose you, that we are more inclined to remember who you are and your faithfulness and your goodness, and have no reason to be tempted elsewhere, Lord. I thank you for your patience with us. I thank you for your forgiveness when we choose poorly. I thank you mostly for showing your love through your son, Jesus. I pray we've honored him this morning in our study, and that we honor and worship him and you in our worship service here in a few moments. In his name we pray. Amen. Thank you.